Ahoy hoy gang! If this is your first time with us, welcome! And if you're coming from a previous video, hey, we love to see it! Season 3 is probably the proverbial tipping point of the entirety of the Venture Brothers. If Season 2 made you curious about where the show was going, and if you should stick around for it, Season 3 is the hook that keeps you sat down, eyes glued to the screen, and wanting for more. Where Season 1 focused on the characters and Season 2 focused on building the world, Season 3 is very much about exploring the past and its impact on characters both old and new. We're gonna get a ton of backstory, a ton of growth, and a ton of reveals you may or may not have seen coming. So take a knee, gang, because we're talking Season 3! Season 3 continues the tradition of editing the intro to focus on different characters. In this one, we pick up right where the Season 2 finale ended, with Dr. Girlfriend and the Monarch being attacked by the Guild, and so the intro naturally is focused around them. Basically, the newlyweds are being interviewed, inquisited, crucibled, what have you, by the Council of 13 to find out about not only Phantom Limb, but to put the two on trial. There are some faces you'd recognize from a cursory glance that have been shown briefly earlier on, and there are others that won't get a proper introduction until much later, but overall it's a great added element that has a lot of cool ideas to explore. And so yeah, the episode focuses on both the Monarch and Dr. Mrs. the Monarch, aka Sheila's, backstories. Phantom Limb was the one that got Sheila to become a supervillain and become his sidekick, while the Monarch started by henching for Phantom Limb and sometimes going out on his own to arch while still figuring out his identity. It really humanizes the Monarch and makes Sheila feel more put together. We've gotten bits and pieces of her story in the past, but now she's actually in the spotlight and a primary focus of the episode. We get Monarch meeting 24 for the first time, him pretending to be Manotar, how Sheila's au pair idea with the murderous Moppet, something they reference back in Fallen Arches that gets expanded on with Tim, Tom, and Kevin actually getting voiced roles this season, all while 21 and 24 struggle to rebuild the cocoon while being pushed around by the Moppets and their knives. You even see Brock and the other villains coming together to help rebuild the cocoon. There's a lot to love about the season premiere, and the way it blends old and new elements together is really commendable. Like, not only do we get the backstory of two of the biggest characters in the show, but we also get the introduction of the Council, the Moppets taking on a more prominent role, and we see that Phantom Limb is still alive after the battle at Cremation Creek. That's what makes this show so special. It doesn't introduce some big all-encompassing bad guy, but it does introduce a lot of smaller yet significant elements that keep moving the story forward. The season premiere doesn't even feature the Venture family. It doesn't need to keep them in the limelight to keep your attention, and that shows just how strongly the characters are written. Not to mention the beautiful soundtrack crafted by J.G. Thirlwell that again just breathes life into such a series. I don't know, I still feel that warmth when the season premiere finishes and you realize you have a whole season this quality to look forward to. When a display for General Manhauser goes wrong because Doc is basically just repurposing all the super science his dad developed, he's assisted by a very talented and cryptic mysterious figure, Dr. Henry Killinger and his magical murder bag. Dr. Killinger proceeds to help Rusty confront the ghost of his past, kicks out Dr. Orpheus with a rezoning clause, and helps the boys with their studies. Naturally, Orpheus thinks there's something nefarious afoot, and he's right. Dr. Killinger is trying to turn Doc into the villain he was always meant to be. This is a terrific angle to lean into, Doc being an arch for his brother Jonas. Like when we see how Rusty grew up, when we see how his dad treated him or made him go through traumatic experience after traumatic experience, it understandably left an impact on him, unlike, say, Jonas, who just kind of came out and didn't have to go through any of that. He's untouched by the poor decisions and the poor parenting of the past. Like I said, this season is all about dealing with the past, and while we got inklings of it beforehand, we're really going to go more in depth into what Doc had to go through and how he has to embrace it and heal, which is a big part of Season 4. Healing and acceptance. Even towards the end of the episode when Doc asks Brock if he's a bad person, Brock can't even give him a straight answer because not even a season ago he reanimated a corpse and was thinking of military uses for it. Right from the beginning, we see Doc trapped in the past. He hasn't come up with any new ideas and just wants to keep reusing the same old ones because his dad was this all-encompassing entity to him, and in a way, I respect that he isn't trying to do that to his boys. Granted, he also seems to constantly hate them, but if he didn't care about them, why would he keep clones of them? Why would he give himself the chance to bring them back? I don't know. You can argue it's just a family thing, but the fact he was willing to keep bringing them back while effectively being a single parent raising them does show he has some form of humanity. Is he flawed? Absolutely. Is he trying? I'd say so. This episode is fantastic in that beautiful blend of great jokes and writing with exploring interpersonal ideas. Again, remember, the series is about failure. It's about the failure of the futuristic ideas, and this season really showcases that. I will also say, if you do look for this show online, you can find uncensored versions. That is because, starting in Season 3, they released uncensored versions of the show. While I will be using the censored versions, understand that that is out there and you can see it. Oh hey, even more backstory! Fun fact, Billy's code name is Little Nemo in reference to Little Nemo and the Adventures in Slumberland, as opposed to Finding Nemo. Just a little aside, but yes, this is the origin story of one Billy Quizboy. A huge fan of the Rusty Venture show, Billy was a regular quiz show genius, running the show circuit and earning a substantial amount of winnings until the show cheats to keep him as the reigning champion and he gets found out. When he confronts the host reveals he's an albino and, you guessed it, he's the Pete White. We see them get kicked out of the Venture compound when they try and get jobs with Doc, and then go on the underground quiz circuit where Billy loses his arm in a dogfight. While left stranded by the side of the road after shunning Pete White, he's saved by the OSI, more specifically Hunter and Brock, who want to use him to prove the Guild of Calamitous Intent is real. This is maybe 10 to 15 years before the start of the series, and the Guild is more or less treated as this boogeyman when the real threat is Sphinx, a not-so-subtle reference to Cobra, with OSI just being G.I. Joe. Honestly, I love every bit of it. Even the Village People soldiers led by Shoreleave, who I'm so glad isn't just a one-off bit character. We also get a reappearance of Race. We see Sergeant Hatred before he went full villain, and yeah, it follows Billy as a spy for Hunter and Brock trying to find out what Professor Phantoma, aka Phantom Limb, is up to, even helping him complete his experiment and causing it to fail, leading to his transformation, which was alluded to all the way back in Victor Echo November. There's just so much to love in this episode, from the nozzle to Brock and Hunter's interactions, Billy being a quiz boy and exploring how he first met the Pink Pilgrim himself. It doesn't feel like it has to be there. It doesn't feel like the entire season is built around it and that it's wholly necessary, and I think that's what makes it feel so strong. It helps give more detail into characters you already knew and loved, while also just being a fantastic watch. It fleshed the world out more, sure, but the ramifications of everything you're shown won't be felt for a minute, and that's what makes this so special. And let's go back to the season premiere when we're introduced to Monarch saying that he's Manotar, and at the end of the episode we see Manotar, and we also see Phantom Limb has survived Cremation Creek. Here, you see all these elements. You see Shoreleave, you see the OSI, you see Sphinx, but they're not brought up again for a minute. They're not reestablished. They're just a joke. They're just an element that you can laugh at without realizing the weight of what you're seeing. Here, we've been introduced to the OSI as a lot of things. They're a secret government operation. They're this, they're that, but they're also a G.I. Joe knockoff. But Brock and Hunter are these fringe characters believing in essentially conspiracy theories that turn out to be real. It lays the groundwork for something bigger going on in the background. And it's one of those things where you may not notice it, but your brain did. I love the intro of this episode. It's just amazing and showcases why Hank and Dean are just the best. We get introduced to Malice, the supervillain gated community, and we see how the Monarch feels stagnant not being able to arch Dr. Venture, while also being given Sergeant Hatred's first proper intro as an arch-villain for Doc. We get to see what a proper arching process looks like, and I don't know, the whole episode feels very humanizing. Hatred inviting the Ventures to a bad dinner party works perfectly for setting up a character that otherwise just had a few very creepy lines in the previous season. It's kind of funny that this episode is kind of out of place compared to everything else we got in the season, and yet it's integral for moving forward. It's not a bad thing at all and helps keep forward momentum while also addressing the past. Monarch moves into Phantom Limb's house, Hatred knew Monarch was stealing from him for years, and his henching venture is his form of revenge. The Moppets and the henchmen still not getting along, juxtaposed with Hank and Dean being friendly with 21 and 24, despite the fact they work for a man that hates their father. together. I don't want to go too in-depth on the story because there's not much to dig into. It's literally just a house party, but the fact that the family can go to a party and not feel endangered is great. It really humanizes the villains and lets them be normal people. Giving the characters multiple layers really makes the transitions you experience later in the show feel not only more natural, but expected in a way. As the series goes on, we keep diving deeper into the characters, and home is where the hate is foundational to having that make sense. We've seen Brock mellow out, Hank and Dean take on more unique personalities, and Doc being much more human. The more they show, the more realized they become. I know it sounds like I'm hanging on to it, but think about it. How many shows were doing that back then? How many shows took the time to gradually make the characters more and more actualized? What may be more common now with shows like Rick and Morty, Archer, BoJack Horseman, etc., you have to remember was out of place for a series that aired in an era of Family Guy, South Park, Drawn Together, and Aqua Teen Hunger Force. It was much more focused on making topical jokes or wacky situations. And yet, the Venture Brothers exists and aims to tell a well-crafted story. I know I'm not talking about the episode itself, but it really needs to be experienced. The dialogue is what makes this episode shine. The fact that conversations carry more weight than sight gags is just amazing, and yet there's still plenty of brilliant content to cover. I don't know, as I've gotten older, I've gotten more and more respect for this episode, and it feels like a proper evolution of the series if you look back at everything that's come before it. Remember Hate Floats? The episode worked so well because it had these supernatural elements just interacting in a normal world. Here you have all these supernatural characters interacting in a normal world. Villains live in a gated community. They play dumb party games. The story progresses with conversations in hot tubs. It's a natural progression, and I love what it's setting up. There's a new day camp at the Venture compound. Come by and learn from boy adventurer Rusty Venture. That's right, they're busing some kids into the compound to take a tour and hopefully bring in some much needed income. And as they're brought in, we're introduced to one of the most controversial characters in the entire show, Dermot. A giant teenager with hands registered as lethal weapons. He is a master of the ancient art of nunchaku. He wears torn jeans, has long greasy hair, and can do like 8 freaking cool roundhouse kicks in a single jump. And yeah, Hank is determined to be friends with the coolest teenager ever because he doesn't know any better. We also get to see how the day camp is basically a recruitment fair for all the different aspects of this world. Scooby-Doo villain, quiz boy, magical master of the mystic arts, boy adventurer / scientist, all reasonable paths for an adventure-minded youth. And so yeah, it's just kids exploring their dreams and having it all go horribly awry. The great thing is, it's a great show of the passion the characters have. The Order of the Triad eagerly teaching kids about the threats of radon, Billy talking all things quiz boy, the captain being the best pirate captain ever, etc. But the most important thing is, all things considered, they're failures at trying to realize their full potential. Action Johnny is struggling in front of the kids as he's confronted by Dr. Z. He's supposed to be like the pinnacle of it, and here he is, just strung out, trying to figure out what's going on. There's a ton to love about the episode, and it's great to see Billy get to work with his hero in Doc. The biodome is great, seeing Brock have to restrain himself is delightful, and again we get to see Hank and Dean diverging more and more. Hank is all about bonding with a fellow teenager, while Dean is actually starting to stand up for himself now. He's actually trying to find his own identity at this point, and it's great to see his growth. And on the flip side of that coin, seeing Hank actually try and have a friend is great. Dermot is not great, but Hank is just happy to have companionship, and honestly, his big golden retriever energy balances out Dermot's Dorito dust and Axe body spray laced aggression. These boys are being forced into a life they don't know or want, and they're growing in 2 completely different but equally valid ways. Hank actually having someone to play off of works great, and then the end of the episode twist of Dermot asking if that was his real dad throws all that into contention, and the theme of the past comes right back and hits you over the head. I gotta say, as time goes on, I do find myself enjoying Dermot more and more. Not because he's misunderstood or anything, just he's that perfect embodiment of teenage angst that just, man, it just shines. Like when you're living that. When this season came out, I was much edgier as a teen. Now I'm very comfortably not a teenager anymore, and in hindsight, Dermot is incredibly well written. He embodies that grungy, almost depressed, lonely lone wolf, three wolves howling t-shirt energy perfectly. There is such a difficulty in writing emotional, angsty teenagers, but Dermot is handled brilliantly. Dermot is so realized that you hate him. You have this visceral antagonistic desire against him because he is just that thing you can't stand. And, now that you can take a step back and appreciate it, Dermot works so much better. While in the jungle, Doc and the family are training an orangutan to box when they're found by Dr. Quinn and her family. Dr. Quinn being Colonel Gentleman's stepdaughter and Doc's childhood friend. And now, the Ventures have to interact with the Doctor, her female bodyguard, and her twin daughters, Nancy and Drew, while hunting down the threat of the mighty Werodile. Doc, reconnecting with a childhood crush and actively trying to run around with an accomplished doctor and adventurer, really puts his failure into perspective. Here is an accomplished doctor trying to find a mysterious fruit in order to cure cancers and make the world a better place. Doc is teaching an orangutan how to box. And yet, even then, Dr. Quinn still likes him. She still sees something worthwhile in him. She sees that there is that shining beacon of hope underneath it all. Doc isn't undeserving of love, he just doesn't know how to love. Seeing Nancy and Drew crush on Dean because he doesn't have any interest while Hank is just throwing himself out there is also great. They're both still trying to figure out how to act and how to interact with other people. Dean is still focused on finding the Werodile. Brock is keeping watch, and yeah, that's pretty much the episode. You see that Jonas was a super scientist that loved to party and sleep around, and Rusty just wanted to be a boy adventurer. There was something pure there once, and that juxtaposition matters. How do you live in a long shadow like that? How do you create something that rivals anything he invented? Sometimes you just need to teach an orangutan to box. Sometimes that just might save the day. The writing is great, and the jokes about the IKEA and the Werodile subplot are fantastic. Again, J.G. Thirlwell's soundtrack builds a false sense of tension, and the fact they're able to insert genuine mystery into a comedy really just shows off the writing talent at play. It's really the first episode of the season, and honestly one of only 3 episodes where the family are the globe-trotting adventurers again. There's so many episodes that focus around the compound and the family just being around, say, bad dinner parties, because we've spent all this time seeing them traveling around the world, and that's what's so important. Season 3 is much more personal compared to Season 2. Where Season 2, the Ventures were dragged along on other adventures or were roped into Phantom Limb schemes, Season 3 is very much focused on just the Ventures and their compound and how they actually start to come together as a family. When you face the past, you can walk towards the future. And even the awkward tension between Dr. Quinn and Doc Venture and seeing them interact after all this time, and you wonder, oh, is she maybe his half-sister or something? What's going on here? This is kind of messed up and freaky and uncomfortable. But it's not his fault. It's not anything that he's doing that causes that uncomfortableness. That's all Jonas Sr. All of the things that make you feel uncomfortable about the episode are what you don't know. It's what you don't understand. And as things do sort of fall into place, you're left with more questions than answers, but that's okay. It's okay for things to be left on just a miserable note. For Doc to get into the X1 and have to fly away, admitting that there will never be love there. And this episode is a perfect example of the idea of having to face the past so that you can walk towards the future. The episode opens with our first introduction to Dr. Entman, a tiny member of the old Team Venture. We then flash back to Doc driving out a giant drill while Brock guides him out, and as they're going, both Brock and Doc fall into the basement. The boys discover they've fallen through and get the triad together because, quote, the basement is super spooky. Brock gets locked into a nuclear bunker in the basement dungeon, and Rusty runs into several people living in the basement of the compound. Rusty is then taken hostage by them and is taken to go meet Father. Turns out the people living in the basement of the compound were trapped there by Jonas Sr.'s AI mother, who disapproved of his basement fallout shelter and trapped a bunch of kids down there years ago who only had VH1 Classic and a re-education bed to raise them. The flashback scene with the old team Venture dealing with Mother pumping gas into the tunnels and causing them to hallucinate is genuinely chilling. Like it's a comedy, and you have someone thinking they're scratching at the wall with their fingers shredding down to nubs. Again, brilliant soundtrack, and I promise I'm not gonna stop gushing about it, but it needs to be said, like you can feel your heart rate pick up watching it. Even the tension of her connecting to nuclear payloads and willing to end the entire world is just, it's gripping. It may be a minor role, but having Pete White around is terrific for this episode. The Triad is terrified of the digital horror. Brock and Doc are trapped, and Hank and Dean don't know what to do. For all intents and purposes, they need an adult, and Pete is the best one they've got. He's a genuine friend to Rusty who doesn't care about his money or fame and is just a good college bud, and I don't know, I really appreciate that about his character. Like, they hang out, they just do dumb stuff together, and he doesn't see him as a boy adventurer. He doesn't see him as a super scientist, he just sees him as Rusty. Like, Rusty, what the hell, bud? Like, Pete is just one of the best characters in the show, and seeing the horror on his face as he genuinely believes the end times are upon him is just fantastic. The episode has so much to love, and it genuinely might be one of the best episodes of the whole show. The introduction of Entman, the passive conversation between him and Brock, Doc dealing with the basement dwellers, even Hank and Dean's just usual boy adventurer vibes, all culminating in a delightfully twisted dark comedy horror showcase that, man, just thinking about it again brings a tear to my eye. I mean, you have Hank and Dean realizing that things are getting too spicy for the pepper, as it were. They understand to take a step back and just let the adults handle things now. Whereas beforehand, take Love Bites, where Hank was running headfirst into all kinds of challenges. Seeing the horrors of the battle at Cremation Creek, they're not going down in that basement. They're leaving things alone now. And I kind of appreciate that more. That they know to just let the adults adult, and even then, the adults fail to handle the situations. If the basement dwellers hadn't sabotaged the payloads with their cleansing, it would have been the end of the world. We're facing all these end of the world threats, we're facing all these giant menaces that can be handled super simply because they think outside of that proverbial super scientist mentality. They know what they're doing, and this episode encapsulates that perfect human thought process brilliantly. Confronted by the robot from the Mr. Roboto music video, the Monarch is just not feeling his new arch, the peaceful and loving Dr. Dugong and his tank of cuttlefish. He misses having an arch he could actually hate and wants to really go after. He hates the system and what it represents, a boot being lodged on his throat. He feels trapped, and when he envisions the wheelchair-bound Dr. Dugong and imagines him as Doc, he unalives him with a laser bazooka to the face. An act of cold-blooded villainy that will have zero repercussions. The episode is honestly a Hank, Dean, 21 and 24 and the Monarch episode. Brock and Doc are away at a conference, and we see Dermot and Hank starting to practice their fledgling band, Shallow Gravy. The Monarch decides to go to the Venture compound and raid it for old time's sake after getting into a fight with his wife, and so he and his best henchmen go to harass the Venture family, completely unaware that Doc isn't even there. And so the episode has Dermot thinking the Monarch's men are aliens, Hank thinking he's immortal, and Dean thinking it's all dumb as he tries to pursue his dreams of being a boy journalist. I love that not only does the Monarch and the whole cocoon read Dean's little newsletter, they write into it. I don't know, there's a quirky charm to their spy work, including just seeing what Dean is talking about and the super vacuum Doc has invented. It's also another mention of the Viceroy, 21's alter ego that he's brought up a couple times in the past. I don't know, the episode is great and really helps build Dermot as a character. Not only do you get him being more of the edgelord you love to hate, but you also start to see Hank questioning some of his bigger claims and Dermot trying to impress them less and less. this. I don't know, it's very humanizing to see Hank actually have friends and be more social than Dean, who's more focused on breaking away into his own thing. We get to see the boys grow as characters, and seeing how far they've come in just 20 episodes is really something special. It's like when Cremation Creek happened, you start to see that real deviation. You see that they're more aware of what's going on than you would have initially thought. In season 1, by and far, they were just along for the ride, happy to go on these adventures and see what's out there, go into space or Africa or wherever. Season 2, they decide to try and solve mysteries on their own and still have that idea of the fantastical. And then in season 3, you very much have them growing up and calling them mystical or professional adults to handle issues they don't want to or it's their responsibility to deal with. I don't know, it really works for their characters, and I'm so glad there's an episode like this before the series cranks into overdrive for that sprint to the finale. Everyone has time to shine, and as we celebrate the growth as the boys move into the future, we need to turn the wheel of time back just a little bit. We get a flashback to an old villain syndicate led by Scaramantula as he plans to take out Jonas Venture Sr. and the old Team Venture. However, at this table of evil is one super scientist in a very kind of pretty racist costume, ready to stop their plans. We see Ant-Man before he got shrank down, Ukuk, their caveman sidekick, and the classic team shining as we pan out to Jonas Venture Jr. opening the Jonas Venture Museum on Spider Skull Island to celebrate his late father. Scaramantula is actually played by Toby Huss, who you'd recognize as Khan or Cotton Hill in King of the Hill, Evel Knievel and Harvey Birdman, and all kinds of roles throughout his storied legacy. However, his time on Venture Brothers, I would argue, is some of his most prolific work, which we'll get into later in the season. And so yeah, it's another ensemble episode that actually has the Venture family taking a more back seat to the rest of the characters on display, and it's kind of nice seeing the side characters being so strong they can carry an episode more or less on their own. While the Ventures are there, they're really there to just kind of push the story along. We find out Colonel Gentleman isn't dead, we see the old Team Venture trying to compete with Scaramantula to get more autographs and pictures, Sally thinks that Jonas cares more about his museum than her, Pirate Captain feels underappreciated by Jonas and tries to form a mutiny temporarily, and through it all, it makes Jonas, who seemed to be the second coming of the late great Jonas Venture, just seem that much more human. Here we see Jonas Jr. failing for the first time. He hasn't had long to stretch his tiny underdeveloped legs, but in that time he's consistently one-up Doc again and again, and now we see he's just like anyone else. He's just trying to understand why everyone loved his dad. He just wants to honor the memory of the great man he never got to meet and try and share in some of the splendor of the good old days. We also get Richard Impossible coming back, and he's sadly no longer voiced by Stephen Colbert, but it makes sense with how busy he was at the time, and he'd later be replaced by one of the best voices in the game. It's also great to see Billy just being able to nerd out with his heroes and his favorite villains, and it's just wild that here these people live alongside the characters they looked up to. That's like if you could watch Superman save the day on the news and then bump into him drinking a Yoo-hoo on the street. Sure, you'd have questions, but the most jarring one would be, why does Superman drink Yoo-hoos? It's just that kind of familiarity that makes this world feel that much more lived in, that much more fleshed out. Their idols are real and inspired by the same things that inspire us. Even in the end of the episode, it's just so charming to see Rusty and Brock just joking about going back and saving Jonas as the island gets ready to blow. In a dark, twisted kind of way, they've developed this camaraderie, and I mean, man, it's so important for where the series is going, but even in this one moment, it feels right that everything ends on a high note. The episode opens with an all-too-familiar Pinecone flying up towards Spider Skull Island, piloted by everyone's favorite villain, the Mighty Monarch! That's right, he has a new arch-enemy, and his name is Jonas Venture Jr. Jonas meets his approach by summoning a giant robot combined with pieces from Pirate Captain, Sally, himself, and a clown head piloted by Ned. Look, viewer discretion advised, it's TVMA for a reason, but I adore this opening so much, and it still makes me roll every time I watch it. And yeah, Jonas proceeds to hand the Monarch his ass on a silver platter and is ready to finish him off for good when Dr. Mrs. the Monarch interjects and tells him if he takes them out, they'll just find a bigger, badder villain to take him out, and the cycle never really ends. You either play the game or you get taken out of it. It's that kind of delicate power balance that I really appreciate. They're not trying to totally wipe out the heroes, it's supposed to be more of a dance. But here we see Jonas just not even humoring the idea and determined to take out the Monarch. However, he has to do it by the book, and after getting laughed at for calling the guild by Watch and Ward, he gets in touch with the OSIs and introduced to Cardholder and Doe, who also introduce us to Pirate Captain's addiction to tranquilizer darts. They bring in Brock to help plot their next move. This is really a great example of Jonas failing at being a super scientist. He's not used to the things that Rusty grew up with or what Jonas Venture Sr. had to deal with. Meanwhile, the Monarch finds out that if he can survive a lethal encounter with Jonas, he'd be able to hench his next of kin, i.e. Doc, allowing him to take back the arch enemy that is rightfully his. And so he sends his best men, 21, 24, and the new Henchman 1, Scott Hall, to go on a covert super double secret operation. The episode is great because here you have this new guy schooling 21 and 24 on the different codes and practices in the Monarch's handbook, which implies that he actually has some kind of order, whether developed by his wife or by himself, that allows him to lead such a large group effectively. We also see them scheme and strategize, and all things considered, he should not be walking away from this operation, but his tenacity is just unmatched. Again, remember, the series is about failure. Jonas fails to live up to the charades in the shadow of his father. He doesn't have it in him to be that kind of super scientist. The Monarch has failed in the past, but he's gotten better, sharper, and more effective. The more you fail, the more you stand a chance to not fail. Each failure is a chance to learn and a chance to grow. You even see Jonas starting to get into the whole thing as the episode goes on, even revving up Scaramantula's cannon as he gets ready to take them out once and for all. It may be minor, but it's great that the museum is still on the island when 21 and 24 are sneaking through, and I mean it may be minor now, but that kind of world building is just fantastic. Does it carry any major weight after this? No, not really. But the fact that they didn't forget about it and even mention it as they look around is an incredible attention to detail that other shows would have forgotten. And again, we may have Jonas and Brock, but we don't have the Ventures proper in this episode, and it's still incredibly solid without them. Like, we've seen so much time taken to focus on so many other characters and pieces of the world, and they have such care in how they're crafted that if you were to wipe the Ventures away tomorrow, they'd still be fully fleshed out individuals. They wouldn't be the same without the Ventures, but you understand who they are away from them, and it really adds that extra layer to it all, especially as we head into the end game of the season. And even looking at season 4, where it's very Venture-centric, where you're constantly seeing what's going on with the Venture family, how they're interacting in this new world. Season 3, stepping back and taking a moment to focus on all these other characters, is integral to season 4 being allowed to do that. And the endgame starts with a conspiracy. Billy is watching old episodes of the Rusty Venture TV show and discovers different codes and starts to parse together that it's one of the greatest mysteries left unsolved, and he's determined to get to the bottom of it. He finds a clue that leads him to the Venture compound where they start tearing up the backyard when Brock tells them to not dig in one specific area because it was part of his assignment. And then they all start digging in that one spot. Fun fact, not only is Yu-Gi-Oh! Canon in the Venture world, but so is the Ancient Gear archetype, which is very oddly specific. It's not Blue Eyes, Dark Magician, Heroes, or anything like super prolific. It's Ancient Gears, an underappreciated GX archetype. I don't know, it could have been anything, and it's Ancient Gears. That's hilarious to me that they went with such an interesting deep cut. Anyway, while they're digging, they dig into Brock's room, and he finds a message encoded into a sound device. When playing it, we get a flashback and are introduced to the original founders of the Guild before it was the Guild of Calamitous Intent, members like Oscar Wilde, Samuel Clemens, aka Mark Twain, Aleister Crowley, Phantoma, Phantom Limb's ancestor, and Lloyd Venture, the ancestor of Rusty and Jonas. They are in possession of a mighty orb that has been crafted for generations by all the greatest minds, and there is internal strife over what to do with the device as the Guild is splintered and facing enemies from all sides, including the diabolical Nikola Tesla. However, as Brock is listening, the recording ends and he has to find the other one to get the full story. But it's only passed along to the different bodyguards of the Venture family. While the family's investigating, they discover that they need to travel to NYC, and both Pete and Al get to show off their clue-solving skills, while Rusty and Billy go on a real boy adventurer adventure. And when Brock tries to get information on what's going on and is putting a code into his computer in his beloved car, he's delisted from the OSI and a gag order is placed with the goal of eliminating him. He runs off to NYC to get to the bottom of things when he runs into Kano, who breaks his vow of silence, thinking Brock has come for his head, and he gives him the other device that implies Sandow took out Colonel Venture when he tried to harness the mighty power of the orb. It's also hinted at that Kano was the one that took out the late great Dr. Venture, but we don't really get any confirmation on that. Again, we never have any idea what the orb does, but it's a pivotal player in everything narratively. Brock is kicked out of the OSI, Doc goes on an adventure with Billy, Hunter knows it's something spooky, and it all centered around this one piece that the greatest minds would fight over. And in the end, when Rusty finds the orb that he's been chasing down, this object of ultimate power, when he's given the chance to use it, he just puts it back out of respect. Something that I don't think a Rusty from any other time earlier in the show would do. This definitely feels like the growth of Doc. Like he's not the same person he was when the series started. He's starting to get that spark, that inspiration back, and it really makes him endearing in a way. Orb really feels like it's about him making peace with his old adventures and finding a way to move on. However, as Brock hitches a ride home and gets off the X1 in the hangar and is blinded by the headlights of his beloved Adrian, we realize that the season is far from over. Brock dismantles Adrian and switches into survival mode. The family is ambushed by Molotov and her Blackhearts, who inform Brock that the OSI has put a bounty on his head and have summoned their best assassins to try and claim it. They decide to try and run, but when they're hunted down, they lose Helper, who is later picked up by the Monarch in his quest to arch the Ventures and raid the compound, blissfully unaware of what's going on. And so, yeah, Brock has to fight off the assassins while keeping the family safe, and that's just part one. We get a proper showcase of Shore Leave and Mile High, now Christian boating and diving instructors with the call signs Holy Diver and Sky Pilot. We get to see Hank bond over his love of Batman with someone, even if they're a stone cold killer, and we see that Princess Tinyfeet has left Sergeant Hatred and is looking to get a divorce, and so he's come to the Venture compound to give up his life and face his demise. Like, I know I skirted over so much of the episode, but it's a very easy episode to boil down to just its bare elements, and something like it could only be effective because of all the time they took establishing all the different pieces. Why does the OSI, that should be this heroic fighting force, have assassins they'd contract to take out one of their own? Why did Molotov choose not to take out Brock, and why did Hunter help him? Hank and Dean are just along for the ride, as is Doc, and in a first, we actually get an episode entirely dedicated to Brock and him trying to keep the family alive. Unlike Showdown at Cremation Creek, the family that slays together doesn't try and introduce a ton of characters at once and shotgun out a bunch of exposition. It gives you 3 assassins and just says enjoy. You get a funny, action-packed, brilliantly animated work of art that sets up the second part incredibly well. Like, the big cliffhanger is literally just Brock and the family getting arrested after he takes out the assassins. You go from assassins to the family having to face the very real idea of actual cops having no idea what's going on. Which again, may not seem that important, but remember how they've built up that all of this is weird to outsiders, and they currently don't have a ton of options. How do they escape one of the most mundane traps of all? And that's the absolute charm of Venture Brothers, is that this very real, very possible threat of the police arresting them, throwing them in jail, separating them, is much scarier to them than, say, the Monarch. While they are unfazed by it, while they do believe that they can get out of this easily if they get a cleaner and get everything taken care of, you have to remember, there isn't anything on the books. Both the Guild and the OSI are very secretive organizations that usually pay off the cops, so if someone is working with them, something else is going on. And then we dive right into part 2. The family is arrested, everything is up in the air, and through it all we're introduced to one of the best characters in the entire series right in the intro. Mentioned all the way back in season 1, but showing up for the first time, voiced by the brilliant, incredible, downright legendary Toby Huss, is my personal favorite character, General Traster, leader of the OSI. A man that eats patriotism and farts freedom. He's that kind of over-the-top in the best way kind of character that feels so natural yet out of place with everything on display. Like, how could he be the one behind the assassins hunting down Brock and his family? How could he be a big bad? Unless... We then cut back to the family struggling to explain what's going on when they're saved by the cleaner called in by Molotov, who gets them out of their situation with his lemon-scented expertise. And with his back against the wall, Brock makes a final stand. With both General Traster and the Monarch on the line, he tells them both he's ready for one last stand at the Venture compound, winner take all. And so they all plan for their final showdown. Again, it's great to see Brock not only trying to keep the family safe, but he's not charging in guns a-blazing. He figures they'll take each other out and he'll just pick off what's left. He's a very smart and talented agent. However, that's not quite how things go. Helper is held hostage and strapped with explosives, Sergeant Hatred confronts Doc, Hank, and Dean in their panic room, and Brock has the Monarch and Traster send their men into an absolute fury. This is when Traster asks Brock what he thinks he's doing and tells him that the assassins weren't even hired by the OSI, he just wanted to talk. But of course, Hank and Dean have no idea what's going on and decide to unleash their secret army to help Brock. Their clone army. So, led by Hatred out into the field, all of their clones stand, bubbles popping on their lips as they struggle to even think, much less fight, as the Monarch activates his battlesuit and guns them all down as he loses control, and Hank and Dean lose their life insurance. And that's me abridging it. 21 and 24 are in the Monarch mobile, and Helper gets in to drive off to fight, and 24 is stuck with the seatbelt fastened, unable to get out, and before you know it, the car explodes with him inside, right as Brock is walking towards the car. We don't even know if Brock survives as the episode cuts and reveals that, sure enough, Molotov used Brock to take out the competition for her Assassin League, the Blackhearts, including a certain Hunter-Gatherers. Like, that's how you end a season. 24 is gone. Brock is MIA, Tracer didn't do anything wrong, and Molotov concocted everything, and you still don't really get the full idea of why. There's still questions lingering, suspense around every corner, and you just want to keep going. And yet, through it all, sure, their clones may be gone, but Hank and Dean live to see another season, drastically changed by the events that they've lived through. They have now not only seen themselves die over and over and over again, but they have had their lives put on the line. They have been hunted down like dogs. And that will have ramifications as we leave this season. And there we go! That's Season 3! Anything you think I was wrong on? Right on? What's your least favorite episode? Most favorite? Let me know in the comments down below. Season 3 is very much about the past and how we confront it. How we grow out of who we used to be, and as we look towards the future, sometimes that bright dawn on the horizon is just headlights and a car bomb. Season 3 is very much the tipping point. If you're not completely invested in the series by the end of Season 3, you just frankly aren't going to enjoy the show. It's just not for you. Everything we've been given up to this point has been perfectly crafted into a shining beacon of what adult animation and even just animation in general can be. Look at where the season started, with flashbacks of how the Monarch started his path becoming a villain, to where it ended with the family being shaken to its absolute core. This entire season has been about establishing a bigger world, establishing the past, establishing all these different connections, and showing you these ideas and building out the organizations that you've become familiar with. Those that know the show know that Season 4 was huge, and while it is also the longest season, it also has the biggest twists and turns, and it only has those because of how Season 3 took the time to not only build the world and the characters, but address their past and help them grow past it into characters that can handle where they're going. If Season 3 is about the past, Season 4 is definitely about the future. It's about Hank and Dean both growing away from their old identities and discovering entirely new ones. It's about leaving your old self behind and embracing that you may not know what comes next. While Season 2 almost mocked the idea of it, Season 4 very much takes on the idea of grief head on. How do you move on after losing your best friend, a mentor, family? How do you move on after a divorce and you're left to rediscover yourself? How do you know who you really are? Like, incredible shout out to everyone attached to the series, because each element just shines because of the love and dedication put into it. It's not to say the Venture Brothers was alone in having darker or edgier elements to it, just look at Moral Oral, a show that had episodes so viscerally upsetting yet captivating, it's beloved to this day. There just needs to be more respect for these ideas of what meta or proto-comedy could be, and we haven't even scratched the surface. Season 4 is just so magical, and I can't wait to talk about it with all of you. We may be coming up on the halfway point, but we still have so many beautiful episodes to talk about. So, truly, from the bottom of my heart, thank you all so much for watching. And if you liked what you saw, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Tell your friends we're out there. And I promise I won't sound like a bore when we talk about Season 4. Good night, everybody. Godspeed, and I believe in you. And most important of all, go Team Venture.